Ahoy there, mates. Welcome aboard the VHS pirate ship. Happy spooky season, and welcome to a very special Halloween edition of REEK of the Week. The little segment here on the VHS pirate ship where I explore and examine different aspects of 80s and 90s nostalgia. It has the sweet stench of childhood memories. It's the show you can smell. It's REEK of the Week. And since it's spooky season, we're going to talk about something that was part of everyone's Halloween. Ben Cooper costumes. Yes, those little vinyl costumes we all had when we were kids, something that you might not realize even had a name. Well, they did, and they were called Ben Cooper costumes. Yes, the costumes that included a little vinyl bodysuit apron thing with a plastic mask. And there were literally thousands of these things in circulation. They ranged from your generic Halloween monster stuff to your licensed characters. Now, why are they called Ben Cooper costumes? Well, it might be a little obvious, but Ben Cooper was the designer behind all the ideas. Yes, he's the man behind Ben Cooper Incorporated, which was a company that designed sets and costumes for Broadway shows, but would also be in the masquerade ball and Halloween costume business, and in 1937, they released their first line of costumes, which was the Walt Disney licensed characters of Donald Duck and Snow White and others of that sort. As time rolled forth, so did Ben Cooper Incorporated, and they would expand their Halloween costume arsenal, and by the mid-1940s, they were one of the biggest Halloween costume distributors in the United States. They were so successful because they were accessible. They were available in pretty much every major store and for very cheap. The average retail price was $1.25, which would be about $15 in future money. The low price point was due to the cheap manufacturing cost of the materials used. The costume was only a thin vinyl smock with some kind of design printed on it with a mask to match said design. And bada bing, bada boom, voila, Ben Cooper costumes cemented their place in history. Now, were these convincing costumes? No, but that wasn't the point. They were a fun and cheap way for your kid to celebrate Halloween, and since they had so many different designs, well, it was pretty much unlimited. And this would be the pattern all the way up until 1992 when the company eventually went bankrupt. But that almost happened 10 years prior. And what does Tylenol have to do with this? What? Tylenol? Yes, Tylenol. Tylenol almost plunged Ben Cooper Incorporated into bankruptcy in 1982. Huh? Well, not exactly Tylenol, rather what somebody did to Tylenol. If you remember, in September of 1982, several people died after taking Tylenol, which is the complete opposite of its intended effect. That's a painkiller, all right. Yeesh. It was then found out that the Tylenol these poor folks took was laced with cyanide. Yeah, some psychopath laced a bunch of Tylenol with cyanide. And this scared the bejeebus out of people, and rightfully so. That's a pretty terrifying thing. And a lot, if not all parents thought, if someone can do this to Tylenol, they can certainly do it to candy. And I mean, hey, there was already a fear of people poisoning trick-or-treat candy, so this just pushed it over the top. And hence, October of 1982 pretty much didn't have a Halloween, as practically no one, and I mean no one, let their kids go trick-or-treating, and therefore costume sales plummeted. But all would not be lost for Ben Cooper Incorporated, as they would regain these sales and continue to be a #1 costume distributor of the 1980s, pretty much as they were through the 70s and 60s. They were successful because they were just neat. I mean, they weren't very well designed, but at the same time, it was an ingenious design. Because they were cheap, they were easy, they were simple, they were fun, and even if you were a really fat kid, you could still fit in these. Trust me on this. Though they really weren't all that comfortable, you couldn't really see out of the mask all that well, let alone breathe very well out of it, and by the time you would come back from trick-or-treating, there would be a thin layer of condensation from your big, sweaty, prepubescent head. But they were still neat, and we didn't care about that kind of stuff. We wanted to be Chuck Norris or Lion-O or just a devil or a witch or a skeleton or a ghost or Snoopy or a Smurf. Really, there was an infinite amount of choices. There were Star Wars ones, Looney Tunes ones, DC Comics ones, Marvel Comics ones, Garfield, He-Man, even GoBots. There was one for E.T. and one for Alien. Wow. There was G.I. Joe, Rambo, as I had mentioned earlier, Chuck Norris, and there were ones that you really didn't expect, like, wouldn't your kid want to be Tattoo from Fantasy Island? Or how about Mr. Spock? Or Farrah Fawcett? There was Jim and She-Ra. And wouldn't your kid want to be one of the Village People? How about Bigfoot? Or one of the apes from Planet of the Apes? Or the $6 Million Man? Or the Bionic Woman? Through the 1960s, all the way up through the 1980s, things got really strange when it came to vinyl costumes. And this is in large part due to the fact that Ben Cooper Incorporated was not the only name in the game when it came to these costumes. But they were the first, and imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, and companies like Halco and Collegeville would follow suit and get into the game as well. And competition between companies means good stuff for the customer. And in between Ben Cooper Incorporated, Halco, and Collegeville costumes, we had some, interesting Halloween costumes. Most of them were your standard stuff, your witches and devils and skeletons and G.I. Joe and Barbie and Care Bears and He-Man and Garfield and Smurfs and Snoopies and whatnot. But then some of them were just plain weird. Like, who would have thought your child could be the Osmonds for Halloween? Let me tell you, if your kid came up to my door dressed as Donny Osmond, he wasn't getting anything. Or perhaps your child was a fan of Joni Loves Chachi. Well, there's a costume for that. Or maybe they were more of a Welcome Back Kotter fan. Well, they're in luck because there were costumes for that. Yeah, not only could you be Barbarino, but also Mr. Kotter himself. Did your kid like Jaws? Sure, it's a great movie. And an even greater costume. Or perhaps they wanted to go as a less threatening aquatic character. Well, they had Flipper. How about the Fonz? Come on, who doesn't want to be the Fonz? There were ones for Mork and Mindy, and Laverne and Shirley. There was one for Hee-Haw, and the Fall Guy, Knight Rider, and Grizzly Adams. And by the way, could we just take a moment to enjoy how delightfully preposterous this Knight Rider costume is? Enough. There was one for Morgan Freeman from the Electric Company. And hey, did your kid like the Rubik's Cube? Who didn't? It was a great toy, one of the greatest toys of all time. One of the greatest costumes? Maybe. Because just look at this thing in all of its glory. Look how ridiculous this is. And again, let's take a moment to appreciate how delightfully preposterous this is. Okay, that's good. And speaking of preposterous, look at the costume for the video game Asteroids. What on earth is happening here? A video game that has no characters whatsoever somehow got a characterized Halloween costume. This thing is horrifying. Your kid would look like bacteria. There was also a Pac-Man one, which is slightly less ridiculous. There was one for Land of the Lost, even one for the Gong Show. Between these three companies, there were thousands of Halloween costume choices, and the licensed character costumes certainly became more popular than the normal Halloween stuff. And these said licensed characters are basically what these three companies are most remembered for. And by the way, I know this episode is about Ben Cooper costumes, but you really can't talk about Ben Cooper Costume Incorporated without talking about Halco or Collegeville. Because really, they're all one in the same. Halco and Collegeville saw the supreme simplicity behind the plastic mask and vinyl costume combination and went with their own versions. Yes, their own versions of the same concept, and we all were winners here. Because throughout these decades, we got some pretty supreme costumes. Even though they were sort of silly and ridiculous, they were still supreme. So when you talk about Ben Cooper Incorporated costumes, you're pretty much talking about Halco and Collegeville as well. And besides, it's not like any of us really knew their names. They were always just vinyl costumes. But really, there were three separate companies doing the exact same thing, and it all boiled down to a licensing war. Yeah, it was all about who could get what licensed characters because they all had different ones. Some had a license for this, some had a license for that. You know how the song and dance goes. Yeah, if something was licensed, these three companies were going to be grabbing for it. Yeah, it sort of became that if there was a toy for it, there was going to be a costume for it. Like there was Pound Puppies, Glowworms, and the Potato Head Kids. I mean, look at this. It looks like a turd. Well, all turds aside, licensing rights and Halloween costumes sort of became intertwined. Even if they didn't make sense, like, look at this. There was a Jaws 2 costume. What? But more often than not, it did make sense. Like there was Gremlins ones, the real Ghostbusters, even the other Ghostbusters. And regarding the licensed characters, these costumes became a great way to advertise. Yeah, just based on the design, there was a tremendous promotional aspect to them. And basically, your kid was a billboard for whatever character they wanted to dress up as. Speaking of that, I always loved how they just had the name of the show or movie right on the front of the costume. like that character would wear a shirt with that on it. To me, it's like the equivalent of wearing your own band's t-shirt. But still, they were great. We all had them. We all loved them. They were part of everybody's Halloween experience. They weren't very comfortable or convincing or even very well made, but man, they were fun. They were a cheap Halloween costume option for the customer and a very efficient advertising vessel for whatever character the costume was licensed for. For product, let's not forget that Asteroids costume or that Rubik's Cube one. Oh, and by the way, there was also a Freddy Krueger one. That's something that shouldn't have been marketed to kids. And ones for all 4 members of KISS. For being so simple and, well, basically cheaply made, these things were just tremendous. And I'm glad that they were part of my Halloween experience as a child. And I'm glad to be part of your Halloween experience right now. So thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. Be sure to hit subscribe. Happy Halloween out there. And I'll see you next time only on Captain Adam's VHS Pirate Ship.